You ever notice how most villains today feel like they were written by someone who's never actually met a human being? They're just evil to be evil. They monologue, they scowl, they blow stuff up, and then they lose. That's not a character. That's a plot device with a costume. Now, most people don't understand this, but if your entire story doesn't fall apart without the villain, you didn't write a villain. You wrote an inconvenience. So today in this video, I'm going to break down why writing a great antagonist is so much harder than writing the hero, and why most writers get it completely wrong. But more importantly, I'm going to show you how to fix it, because your story isn't just about the hero winning. It's about who they have to become in order to stand a chance. And the only way that works is if the villain is believable. So let's get into it. There's this assumption that a lot of people make about writing villains, and that's that it's easy. That all you need to do is have a scary guy in a black coat with a strange, tragic backstory and then a gravelly voice, and boom, you've got your antagonist. But I'm going to tell you something that newer writers don't want to hear. Writing a good villain is way harder than writing a good hero. See, heroes get help. They get the backstories, the love interests, the sidekicks, and they get to grow and they get to change. Good villain has to show up already dangerous, already fully formed, and already in control. They don't get to find themselves over the course of the story. They are the story, or at least they should be. And yet, in most of the stuff I see lately, all the villains seem like an afterthought. They're just dropped in to give the plot a direction. They're generic. And worst of all, they're forgettable. And the problem with that is if your villain doesn't matter, then your protagonist doesn't matter either. Because no one cares if your hero saves the world when the person threatening it feels like they wandered in from some video game cutscene. A lot of this, I think, comes from misunderstanding what a villain actually is. A villain isn't just the person the hero has to stop. He's the reason that the hero has to change. And they're the thing that makes the protagonist's life harder, not just externally, but internally. See, a good villain isn't just evil, they're right. Or at the very least, they think they are. And your story is stronger when the reader can almost see it the villain's way. So I'll break down a few examples here. Let's take Magneto from the X-Men films. Not the comic book supervillain with the helmet and the world domination plot, but I'm talking specifically about the one played by Michael Fassbender. That Magneto makes sense. Magneto makes sense, and you understand why he's angry, because he's a Holocaust survivor watching history repeat itself, but for the mutants. And he's done, just done waiting to be the victim. And his actions are violent, sure, but his motivations are grounded. And that tension, that slight, uncomfortable part of your brain that says, he might be right, that's what makes him work. Now compare that to something like Ronan, or what was his? Yeah, Ronan the Accuser from the Guardians of the Galaxy movie. You remember him? Probably not. He was just an angry space zealot, number 4, with a giant hammer and no actual point. He was evil because reasons. There was no ideology, no personal conflict, no real dynamic with the heroes beyond, I'm here to break stuff and destroy things. And because of that, the entire movie's climax has to rely on jokes and distractions rather than any real tension. See the difference? So when I write a Cole Harper book, I spend just as much time thinking about the antagonist, if not more, as I do Cole. And it's because whoever he's going up against is going to shape the entire narrative of the book. And I don't care how witty his comebacks are, or how close he flies to the edge of a cliff, or even how many punches he throws. If the person he's up against is dull and boring, then the whole story falls apart. Now, in number 4, that's getting ready to release here in a little less than a week, the villain isn't one of those generic arms dealer with henchman kind of guy. He's a man who believes he's the rightful heir to something that was stolen from his people generations ago. And he's a man who's willing to kill for it, not out of greed, but out of principle. He thinks everyone else is wrong. He thinks he's the hero of the story. And in his mind, he's not doing anything wrong. He's correcting history. And that kind of conviction, that makes everything Cole goes through harder to deal with. And it adds tension in places where otherwise it would just be action. And this is the that most stories skip. They build a villain with all the right aesthetics, but none of the internal logic. And look, aesthetics are fun. A creepy voice, a cool design, a dramatic entrance, all those things are cool, right? They're great. But if there's nothing underneath, it just doesn't land. Now, there's a couple that have done it right. I think James Patterson has a huge, huge underrated talent. And yes, I'm saying it's underrated, as acclaimed as James Patterson is, about how he gets the villains right. They're scary as hell. But when you read any of their motivations, some of them may seem surface level as evil just to be evil, but they have a reason. And it's usually done through the lens of, the criminal profile that's built around them. In their own sick, twisted, and demented criminal minds, they make sense to them. And that is what makes it work. Even in movies, some of them do it right. Look at Hans Gruber in Die Hard. You know, he's not just a terrorist. He's not a terrorist at all. He's a thief tending to be a terrorist to cover up the heist. He's smart, he's ruthless, and he's always one step ahead until he isn't. And he doesn't rant about world domination. He just wants the money. And he doesn't have any problem killing for it. So he's a bit of a sociopath, but he's clever and you respect him even though you want to see him fail. Let's see. Another bad example would be the villain from Thor: The Dark World. Literally no one remembers his name because he wasn't a person. He was a placeholder. He's just a reason for Thor to swing a hammer and get to the next scene. The Obi-Wan series, they tried to do something with Riva, but her motivations were a mess until I think the last episode, and by then it was too late to give a crap. Secret Invasion made its villain a shapeshifter with no real ideology other than I'm mad. And that's not a character, that's a toddler having a tantrum. Here's what I want other writers to understand, especially if you're writing adventure or action stories like I do. Your villain doesn't need to be likable. They do need to make sense. They need to believe in what they're doing. And that belief needs to run so deep that it starts to infect the protagonist's thinking too. Maybe not to get them to see it their way, but to realize this person is a true believer. That's where the real heat in a narrative comes from. And you don't need to make your villain sympathetic. You need to give them reasons. And if your story gets better when you cut all their scenes out, that means the villain wasn't pulling their weight. That means the villain wasn't doing their job. You should start over from the beginning. At the end of the day, a good villain isn't about the thing your hero defeats. They're the thing that your hero has to overcome within themselves in order to win. The ones we remember aren't evil just for the sake of it. They're the ones that walked into the room, they made their case, and they almost convinced us they were right. And that's why they're terrifying. So, how do you actually do it? How do you make a villain believable, especially when they're not the main character and they don't get a lot of page time? First, you start with their lens. Before you write a single line of dialogue, figure out how your villain sees the world. Not just what they want, but why they think they deserve it. What past experience shaped that view? What did they see or survive that convinced them that their way is the only way? If your villain thinks that they're the hero, then their logic has to work for them. And if you do it right, it'll almost work for the readers too. Second, you have to tie in their goal to something personal, not vague, take over the world, but something specific, something emotional. I mean, if you look at Wilson Fisk in Daredevil, he was a crime boss, but almost all of his motivations came from the loss of Vanessa, his wife. And I think he had a kid too, but I don't remember which universe that was in, but it doesn't matter. The point is, a lot of his motivations and actions were based on, his childhood trauma. They were based on, he lost Vanessa. He didn't like having other people get one over on him because he felt powerless most of his life. It was revenge, it was redemption, it was proving he was right and reclaiming what was taken. Anything that can't be untangled from who your villain is what you need to make sure is there. Readers don't respond to general evil. They respond to desperation, to the kind of motives that whisper, if I was in their shoes, would I do it too? And third, you need to give them some restraint. Not every good villain needs to be constantly foaming at the mouth. In fact, most of the chilling villains are the ones who don't fly off the handle. They're the ones who stay calm, they speak clearly, and they justify the horrific thing they just did like it was Tuesday afternoon. You that contrast, that disconnect or juxtaposition, whatever you want to call it, that's where menace lives. Because if they're not emotional about it, it means they're already convinced they were right. And fourth, you have to show us what they're afraid of, not necessarily in some big dramatic way, but these power hungry villains are usually driven by some kind of fear, losing control, being taken over by someone else, or humiliation, something like that. When you show a crack in their armor, just a little hint of what's underneath makes the whole character more believable. Not because they're sympathetic, but because they're real, and real people are messy. And finally, and this is the big one, you have to make sure that your villain's choices shape the plot. They should be the ones creating pressure. If they disappeared, your story would collapse. If the hero is just wandering around, reacting to random things, then your villain's not doing their job. You want a believable villain. You have to let them pull the strings. Let them force the hero to act. Not because they want to be evil, but because they genuinely think the world will be better if they win, or at least their world. And that's how you make a believable villain. You have to stop thinking of them as the bad guy and start thinking them as a person who just happens to be standing in the hero's way for reasons that make sense to them. Because the truth is, no one thinks they're the villain of their own story. If if your villain thinks he's the bad guy, then they're probably not worth writing. So yeah, writing a great villain, it's not just making them scary. It's making them convincing. If they think they're right, if they're smart, if they're driven, and just dangerous enough to give the hero a hard time and almost lose, then you've got something. That's when the story tightens. That's when tension hits. And that's when your reader stops skimming, looking for interesting parts to read, and they start leaning in. Because the truth is, readers don't just show up for the hero, they show up for the fight. And a weak villain or a pointless villain makes the fight meaningless. So if you're stuck in your story, if you're feeling like maybe it feels flat, maybe it might not be the pacing, it might not be the plot, it might just be that the villain isn't doing their job. If you fix that, the rest of your story might just come alive. Well, that's going to do it for this one. So thanks for watching. And if you want more storytelling breakdowns like this one, hit the subscribe button and check out the other videos on the channel. But I'll see you guys in the next one.